Okay, we've been teaching through the Gospel of John over the last many months. For those of you that have not been here, those of you that have been here know that we've been doing that for most of last year. Our story continues with another occasion where Jesus appears to his disciples following his resurrection from the dead. And he only appears a limited number of times. We don't know exactly how many times. This is the third time that the story that we're going to look at today. It's the third time he's appearing to a group of disciples. And I have to believe that he's doing it with real intentionality. I have to believe that as he's appearing to them, he's got something really specific to show them in terms of the future of the church. And so, just as obviously he had a very clear message for them, I believe these things are very applicable to us today. One of the key things that comes out in the story today is this whole thing of what Jesus is like. And so, when you think of the disciples, humanly speaking, after Jesus left, everything was up to them in terms of the church. Here's these 12 guys, actually down to 11. 11 guys, everything was dependent on them from a human perspective. And so Jesus takes this time specifically to reveal certain things to them. And so for those of you being baptized today, I really believe that these things we're going to talk about today are just really key in terms of what it means to walk with Jesus. And just as applicable to all the rest of us. So we're going to read the story. It's already up on your screen there. From John 21, 1 to 14. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. So there's 7 of them. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. In the passage just before this, the one that Mark preached on last week, the disciples are still in Jerusalem. Now they are up by the Sea of Galilee. It's about 120 some odd kilometers as the crow flies up to there. They're fishermen by trade. For whatever reason, they preferred to fish at night, and we see various occasions of that. They've been fishing all night and caught absolutely nothing. When these disciples had first met Jesus, they had actually left their trade. So some of these guys were fishermen. The ones here, likely all of them were fishermen, but they'd left their trade and followed Jesus. And very likely at this point, they just plain needed some food. We know from other stories, it's when they left their trade, they didn't get rid of their boats. They still had their boats. They used their boats. All through the Gospels, you see them using their boats at different times. And so they needed some food, and so the obvious thing was, let's go do what we know to do. We need some, let's go fishing. We need some income, and so they went and did that. And just reflecting on this passage in light of the verse just previous to this, in the previous chapter, the last verse, it's actually kind of the key verse for the whole Gospel of John. It says, "But these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And I'd like to say this morning, these things are written so that by believing them, you'll have life in his name. By believing these things, our lives are changed. And so, as I already mentioned, I want to just have as our topic this morning, what is Jesus like? He's like a whole bunch of other things too. But there's certain things that I think are very appropriate for us, especially in light of the baptism today, but certainly for every one of us. Now, the things I'm going to talk about, many of us will say, well, I know those things. My question for us is, do you know them experientially? Yeah, you know them up here. Hopefully, many of us do know them experientially, but certainly in my own life, I realize I need to know that on that level more and more and more. Do I live in the reality of these things? And so let me just go through a number of things that I think is really clearly follow out of the story. The first one is just an obvious one, but I believe it's at least worth mentioning, and that is that Jesus is the resurrected Christ. One reason I believe Jesus appeared to his disciples a number of times was that there could be absolutely no doubt that they saw him after he'd been dead and he was raised from the dead. And so again Jesus appears, and again Jesus appears, and this time, the third time, he appears to them again. Not only do they see him, they actually experience some things from him. And so we know all kinds of stories have gone, oh, they're just all hallucinating. Well, no, these were fishermen. There's a whole group of them. They weren't hallucinating. They didn't just suddenly, oh, somehow we caught fish. They experienced very real things from Jesus. So, secondly, I'd like to say from this story, Jesus knows exactly where you're at. Every one of us here this morning, Jesus knows exactly where you're at. Jesus knows exactly where you're at all week long. Whatever you're going through at different points, none of it's a mystery to Jesus. He knows everything you're going through. Put yourself into the story. I find it interesting. Like I said, they were down in Jerusalem the last time Jesus appeared to them. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have all these things. They hadn't seen Jesus since. How did he know they're suddenly 120 kilometers north? Jesus knows where we're at. Not only did Jesus, he wasn't just coming looking for them, he came totally prepared. He came, had a fire ready. He had brought some fish for breakfast. He'd brought bread. He came completely prepared because that's where the disciples are going to be now. And so for us, one of the things that we need to hear over and over again, whatever you're going through, Jesus knows where you're at. Very common verse, Psalm 139, verses 2 and 3. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. Knows what you're thinking. You discern my going out, my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Very much connected to this, I'd like to say thirdly that Jesus knows our need. They're about 100 yards from shore, as we already read. And Jesus hollers out, hey friends, got any fish? No, we're skunked, we got nothing. Reminds me of going fishing at one point with Daniel and Paul and Jacob and myself. We were up in Port Alberni. Any of you been in Port Alberni? Gone fishing out of there? So we rented a charter boat because we don't know what we're doing. And so this guy took us out and we got skunked. We're out there for hours, and the guy kept us out there way longer than we paid for because he felt so bad that we hadn't caught any fish. So he finally brought us in, docks the boat, and he says, I'll be back in about 20 minutes. I'm going, what? And he just disappeared. He hadn't taken any money from us. He hadn't gotten any info from us, any contact info or anything. He comes back in about 20 minutes, and he's got 6 big fish for us out of his freezer. He felt so bad. He says, here, will this do? Well, the disciples did what they thought they should do, and they experienced utter failure. Here's an interesting little tidbit. The disciples never catch fish in the Gospels without the assistance of Jesus, but they're fishermen. Okay? One of the biggest lessons that all of us can learn in life, this applies to all of us, one of the biggest lessons we can learn, and it comes directly out of this story, and that is without Jesus, you can do nothing. You can't do anything without Jesus. Nothing worthwhile, nothing that produces life. I'm not saying you can't walk down the street. I'm not saying you can't do things, but you can't do anything of worth without Jesus. Nothing of significance. And so the good thing is, here's these guys who got skunked, and when we get skunked, when we're in need, when we realize I need something more, guess what? Jesus always wants to be involved. We all have those times where we've put forth effort, we've done what we know to do, and we come up dry in some way, where we're either trying to beat an addiction, or we're trying to quit a bad habit, or we're trying to change some form of behavior, or we're having some kind of relational struggle with someone, or as Paul expresses in Romans chapter 7, the things that I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do, I end up doing. Jesus wants to be involved. Various ones of you here have been involved in various 12-step type programs, and you've found real help and freedom in those. I always think that the first two steps of specifically of AA, I think, say exactly what we're talking about right here. The first step says, we admitted we were powerless, in that case, over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. That's true for every one of us. May not be alcohol, whatever the thing is in your life, all of us need Jesus. We can't do it without him. Our lives are powerless on our own. And the second step is very applicable as well. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and that power is Jesus. He's the one who can actually bring us life. And I know many of you many of you have discovered that and know that. The sad thing is that sometimes people are out fishing, I'm speaking figuratively now, and they get skunked and they think everything's fine. For these disciples, not everything was fine. These guys weren't just out for something to do. These guys were out because they're fishermen. They're wanting food. They're wanting income. And so they recognized their need, and Jesus saw their need. The healthiest place all of us can be all the time is to realize, I need Jesus. I can't do it on my own. And as a regular course of life, for all of us to realize I need to live in a place of connection with him, because that's where life happens. And so in our story, Jesus tells his disciples to throw their net on the right side of the boat, and they'll find some fish. The thing I'd like to say with this is Jesus is more than enough. He's more than enough to fill whatever places of need we have. They immediately catch such a huge haul of fish that they weren't able to haul the net into the boat. They end up dragging the net ashore, and like good fishermen, they count them. How many do you think there are? How many of you, if you're fishermen, count your fish? How many are fishermen? Same number of hands. Everybody counts their fish. How many were there? I remember we went fishing once, 4 of us. This was back in the day when, you could catch 8 per day, or that was your possession limit. So we had 96 fish. We counted them. Okay? And so, interesting. I looked up on the internet, okay, what kind of fish are in the Sea of Galilee, There's a fish, which is a real common fish in the Sea of Galilee, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right or not, called bini. And they're typically between like 13 to 17 pounds. So if you average about 15 pounds per fish at 153 fish, that's about 2,300 pounds of fish. That's a lot of fish to suddenly, whoop, we get all these fish. That's about, I figured this out, I forget what the number is now. That's over 300, that's almost 400 pounds of fish per guy. That's not bad. And it's interesting that they hadn't recognized Jesus on shore yet, very likely, because it says it was early morning. So probably it was still dark, somewhat dark out. This guy, interesting that they listened to him. Didn't know who he was yet, but this guy says, try the other side. And so, interesting what John and James, the two sons of Zebedee, who are in the boat, interesting, as soon as they catch the fish, what does John say to Peter? Hey, I recognize this. I've seen this happen before. It's the Lord. And so Peter immediately throws on his outer garment, jumps in, swims to shore. Jesus is recognized through the abundance that came once they did what he said. Very interesting to me. They didn't recognize him with their eyes, but as soon as they saw what happened, they said, ha, this is the Lord, man. Jesus isn't barely enough or barely sufficient or barely has enough strength or barely has enough wisdom. Jesus is way more. And so we could talk about all kinds of stories from the Bible, but let me just mention a few of them. The one I already mentioned, very interesting to me again. This is right in the beginning, Luke 5, right in the beginning of when Jesus first called these 12 guys to follow him. And so this is before they'd officially become disciples of his. Jesus is teaching from Peter's boat, and he says, hey, after they finish teaching, he says, why don't you go into deep water and let your nets down for some fish? And same thing. Peter's like, we fished all night. We didn't get anything. And Jesus says, well, give it a go, you know. And so they go out. Same thing happens. That time they had to get their friend's boat. Hey, we can't get the fish in. Help. And so we see this overabundance of what happens. It's like there's two bookends. Jesus wants to tell him at the beginning, I'm way more than enough. And Jesus wants to tell him at the end of his earthly ministry, I'm way more than enough. Another story, we went through this actually for those that were here for the teaching of this gospel. In a wedding, Jesus and his disciples are at a wedding, John chapter 2. They run out of wine. The weddings in those days would go for like a week long at different points, a long celebration. They run out of wine, which was the ultimate insult for the bridegroom. And so Jesus doesn't just make wine out of water, he makes an overabundance. I figured it out, according to the gallons, is between 250 and 680 bottles. That's a lot of wine. Numerous other times in Scripture, God gives or brings more than enough. Let me just give you a couple other scriptures. Psalm 23, verse 5, very familiar psalm. But verse 5 there says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. We typically, obviously speaking figuratively, but when you think of someone pouring, and it's full, they just keep pouring. No, it's full. What's he saying? He's saying, you know what? You're wasting it. No, there's lots. There's lots. My cup overflows. That's what Jesus is like. One more, Ephesians I won't go through that one, but Ephesians 3:18-21. God is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. Able to do immeasurably more. Vanessa, if you want to go let the kids know that they're ready to come down. And any of you that, if you want to get changed or need to get changed for the baptism, we'll be done here in about 5 minutes. So if you'd like to do that, feel free to do that. So the point here, when I talk about there's more than enough with Jesus, the point isn't that we always get way more than we need. The point is that he's got more than enough. He's never short. God's resources are never exhausted. The other thing that's very important here is they only got the fish once they obeyed Jesus. From a fisherman's perspective, it seemed ludicrous. What do you mean throw the net on the other side? We've tried both sides. We've been doing this all night. We throw them on that side, we throw them on that side, it doesn't work. Jesus says, throw it on the other side, throw it on the right side of the boat. And so they do. And then it happens. And so for all of us, very important, what do we see God come through? What at different times he's going to tell us to do something in the process. And so very important that we also listen to him. The last thing I want to mention, I also find very interesting, and that is that Jesus serves them. The one who commands us also serves us. You think, hold on, this is the risen Christ? Like he serves us? He brings them a meal? And the thing I want to say out of that is he actually desires fellowship. He actually desires to just plain eat with us. He desires to hang out with us. He brought everything ready for the meal. I don't know how they bring fire in those days, or if they used flint or what they did, but he had a fire going. He had fish already. He had bread. He'd brought everything. It reminds me of Revelation 3, verse 20, where Jesus, this is Jesus speaking, here I am, for each of us. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. I actually had to think about this, to be honest. I know this concept. Most of you, if you're a regular part of the church, you know the concept. Jesus wants to eat with us. He wants to hang out with us. But whenever I get ready for any teaching, I try to be really honest with myself. Okay, am I really there? Because you know what, to be honest, I think I usually want to hear something from Jesus. Or I usually want to ask him something. It kind of reminds me of guest speakers, and I've been the guest speaker at different places, and people always want to ask you stuff. Sometimes I feel sorry for guest speakers. Just let it be. Do I actually have the concept of just plain being with Jesus? Without needing to hear something from him, without needing to get a word, without needing to ask for something more, can I enjoy his presence? Just plain enjoy being with him. I think behind it all, that was part of what was going on with Jesus. Because he came prepared with a meal. And he said, you guys, I just want to eat with you. I just want to be with you. And so this was freshly challenging to me, to just plain be with him. Just enjoy his presence. And so just to recap briefly what we've talked about, he knows exactly where you're at. Jesus knows our need. He's more than enough. And he desires fellowship. He desires to actually eat